Hey guys, what's going on? Jacob here. So last time we started learning about HTML. We learned how to create a basic HTML document and the tags and elements that you can use on a page. Today we'll continue that path as we finish learning HTML, and we'll also create our first working web page. So let's get to it. One of the best ways to display data is through a table. It makes it easy for readers to parse through all of the information. Creating tables in HTML can be a pretty tricky process, especially for first-time learners. However, if you follow these steps, you'll find that it gets much easier as you go on. First, we need to use the table tag to signify that we have a table here. Everything we add to the table will be between the tags. From here, you can use the t-head and t-body tags to denote the table header and the body of the table. These tags aren't required, but they make the code a bit easier to read and understand. Next, we have our table row tag. This denotes a new row for the table, and our table cells will go here. And finally, we have our table heading and table cell tags. They basically do the same thing, create a cell to put data in. The only difference is that the table heading tag is for column or row headings, which by default make them bold on the page. So if we were to put together a sample table, our HTML would look like this. Before we leave the topic of tables, I do want to note that cells can cover more than one column. To do this, you'll need to use the call span attribute and denote how many columns you want this cell to cover. Images are becoming the most important part of a page. We as humans love visuals, and it's hard not to be drawn to a big image either on a screen or in print. Fortunately, adding an image to the page is super simple. We just use the image tag. Of course, to get that image to show, we'll use the src or source attribute to link to the image. Now before I continue, I do want to talk about relative and absolute links. Absolute links are basically the URL of the page that you're viewing. They include the HTTP or HTTPS. These links don't worry about what directory you're currently in. Relative links, on the other hand, do depend on what directory you're in, but they also make things easier because you don't have to write out quite as much. So say for example, a page we're working on right now is in one directory and our image is also in the same directory. In that case, all we need to put in the src attribute is just the name of the file and the file tag. Say for example, our image is in image directory, which is located in the same directory. Then we put images / the file name and the file type. And this is basically the same whether it's images or even a link to a page. There are also a couple of other attributes that you should know about. The height and width attributes are fairly straightforward. They dictate the height and width of the image. The alt attribute allows you to put alternative text that screen readers will use and will also show if the image doesn't load. In addition to images, we can also add audio to our site. First, upload an audio file to your site files. Then, add the audio tag in your HTML. Unlike the image tag, the only unique attribute for this tag is controls. Put controls in there if you want the controls for the audio to show. Then, inside the audio element, put the source tag. Then use the src attribute to link to this audio file. Then denote what the audio file type is. You can add as many sources as you like. The browser will select the first one that it can work with. Finally, before the closing audio tag, write some text that says your browser doesn't support audio. This text will only show if the user's browser doesn't allow audio. It's a courtesy thing. I do want to note that the best way to add audio to your site is going to be by uploading to a server like SoundCloud and then embedding that in your site. The quality and your site will be much better. We can also add video to the page. The way to add video is very similar to how we add audio to the page. The only difference is that there is no source tag and the audio tag has an src attribute directly. Otherwise, the implementation is the same. While this might look like fun, your best bet for adding video to your site is by uploading it to YouTube or Vimeo or something similar and then using their embedded code to embed your video on your site. It's going to help with server space and the quality will be much better. Finally, let's cover forms. Sometimes you want the person viewing your webpage to submit data to you, either maybe a comment on a page or a survey. And to do that, you're going to need to create a form. Creating forms can be a bit of a tricky and time-consuming process, but the good news is that the individual parts of a form are pretty easy to use. It's just putting it all together that can be the tricky part. So, let's get started with forms. So obviously, the form starts with the form tag. It's here where everything included in our form will go. And the form tag has a couple of very important attributes. First, you'll need to include the action attribute. This will usually be a PHP file that's called when you hit submit, and it'll take that data and do something with it. We don't know how to do that quite yet, so we'll just ignore it for now. Next, there's the method attribute, which dictates how the data will be sent. The most common ways are through get, which sends the data through the URL, and post, which sends the data through a header that you can't see. This is something that the action file will use, and again, we don't know how to do that yet, so we'll just ignore it for right now. A lot of form elements will have a label or small text above, below, or next to it. They're not required, but they can make the form a lot easier to read, and they can connect to the field with the for attribute. Fieldsets and legends are also not required, but they can be good tools to help you organize your form. The field tag essentially makes it known that this is a section on your form. Meanwhile, the legend tag makes a heading with the field set to help describe the section of the form. The most popular form element is the input element. You can have just about anything with this. You can have a text box, a password field, or something similar. All you need to do is put the field type that you want in a type attribute. You can also use the value attribute to define a default value for the field. And you can add a placeholder value with the placeholder attribute. And with HTML5, you can have a date time, month, color, number, email, telephone number, URL, and more. It's a Swiss Army knife of form elements. Also, with form elements, you want to use the name attribute with a unique name for all of them. We'll use this when we start working with PHP and using the data. But that's not all the input element can do. Changing the type of the input element to checkbox will create a checkbox for a user to select or unselect. There is one more thing that you'll need to do for this field. You will need a little bit of text after the element so that the user knows what they're selecting or unselecting, in addition to the value attribute. Otherwise, it's basically the same. You can also add radio buttons in a similar fashion. Radio buttons in a group can only be selected one at a time. The only difference between these and checkboxes is that all of the radio buttons need to have the same exact name. The only difference between them is the value attribute. Also, you change the type to radio. Otherwise, it's pretty straightforward. Another element that you can have in a form is a select menu. Here, you can have a drop-down for a user to select a value. This element requires two tags, the select tag and the option tag. The select tag is where your ID, classes, and name attribute will go. And inside the select tag is where you'll put all of the options and their value attributes to create the drop-down. Then, the user will be able to select one of those items. So earlier we talked about text fields. They're great and all, but if you've noticed, they only have one line of text. And maybe we want the user to type a whole paragraph. That's where text areas come into play. Text areas are similar to inputs, but there are a few key differences. Text areas are similar to inputs, except for the fact that it has its own tag and it requires an opening and closing tag. And everything inside those tags will be included in the data. With this new tag comes a couple of cool attributes you can use. You can specify the height of the text area with the rows attribute, and you can specify the width of the text area with the calls attribute. Finally, every form has a way to submit or clear the data, and we do that with buttons. Once again, we'll head back to our trusty friend, the input tag, except that this time, we change the type attribute to submit if we're submitting the data, or reset if we're trying to clear the data. And lucky for us, the functionality is built right in. When we hit submit, the action file we called in the form tag will run, and when we hit reset, the form will automatically be cleared. Now, let's put this all together for our first HTML page. So first, create a new folder or directory named Our First Site. Then upload your favorite image into that directory. Next, create an HTML file called index.html and add in our base setup for a page. Next, let's add a page title. We'll call this page Our First HTML Page. Then in the body, let's add a heading 1 title. We'll make this text read Our First Page. Then we'll add some paragraph text. I'm using Lorem Ipsum text, which is the standard dummy text. Then inside of one of our paragraphs, let's add a link to our favorite website. Next, we'll add a list at the end. Let's make this an unordered list. After that, let's add our favorite image. Then we'll add a table with a couple of rows of data. And finally, we'll add a small form where a reader can leave a comment for us. And that's it. Open this file in your browser and you'll see your page on the screen. Pretty cool, isn't it? Well, that's all for today. Next time we'll start to style that page and learn more about CSS. In the meantime, if you have any questions about HTML, leave them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer them. But until next time, good luck and happy coding.